And as I promised, a little bit late because I'm in the car. I was in the tunnel, just came out. We'll be discussing a poem, A Stop in the Woods on a Snowy Day by Robert Lee Frost. We'll discuss a little bit about him and the meaning of the poem. But before we get to it, a little bit of prelude, I would say. When times are tough and you see a lot of senseless things happening around the world, like this senseless death, war, children, women suffering. Without purpose. I mean, war in general has no purpose. On the defense side of Ukraine, there is a purpose, obviously, but on the attack side, there is no purpose, and many of the soldiers see it and they desert. You start looking for a way to lift the darkness that surrounds you, a darkness that encompasses you, and many people are depressed from that. There are three ways I find to battle that. One way is to have action, to do something. Because the more you are sitting around, the more you are feeling sadness. And Robert Lee Frost was actually someone who had bouts of depression. His entire family had that. He had to commit one of his daughters to a mental asylum. His sister, there were two siblings, him and his sister, he had to commit to a mental asylum because of depression. You realize that one has to go into action. I mean, the famous Rabbi Maimonides, he was in bed for like 2 years till his wife told him, come on, get out of this depression. I know your brother died, but you need to feed the family. And so he decided to become a doctor. So, a lot of people are called into action. They donate and they feel good about that and they feel that they're helping. That's one way, not the only way. The other way is to look for inspiration in books, in the Bible, or in poetry. And this poem, I think, encompasses both. And I would like to thank Rabbi Akiva Eisenstadt. We had with him a very interesting class on Saturday. And a little bit of that poem that I will read to you today. Hopefully I remember it, because I'm in the car, so I can't read it. I have to watch the road. And we will discuss the poem, and I would love to hear your opinions about that poem. Sorry if I cannot read the messages you guys are sending over. So, this poem was written 100 years ago in 1922. Robert Lee Frost was born in 1874 in San Francisco, California. His dad died when he was 11-year-old from tuberculosis, leaving them only $8. Now, $8 in today's money would be around $255. And they moved. His grandfather invited them over to Massachusetts, where he was in charge of a mill. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Lee Frost, written in 1922, 100 years ago. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds, the sweep of easy wind and downy flakes. The woods
are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This poem he wrote in a few minutes came to him between a state of sleep and wakefulness. And I think it summarizes a few very important points that we must learn. One thing is to have a balance between the promises we need to keep, the jobs we need to do, and stopping and enjoying the nature, being part of it, because that is what gives us solace, what gives us energy, even in the darkest evening of the year, in the winter solstice, in a time when it is dark, cold, maybe hopeless. We can draw on nature, learn from it, how it survived all this snows, tornadoes, floods, and sprang back, the circle of life. The other thing it teaches us is that we should never completely get lost, derailed, whether it is due to sadness, depression, because there are others who depend on us. And we must remember that, because we promised, and we must keep the promise. Promise, first of all, to ourselves, to be true to our nature, just like Robert Lee Frost was. He was dogged in his writing. Even though he tried different jobs, he was a farmer for 7 years. He tried, actually it was 9 years, he tried to farm a farmhouse that his grandfather gave him. But in the mornings he would wake up, and some of his most beautiful writing was written during that time. Eventually he sold the farmhouse and he got back into teaching. Same approach he had with his beloved wife, Eleanor White, who shared with him the podium of the valedictorians when they graduated high school in 1892, when he was 18. And he asked her to marry him, and she said, no, I have to finish college. And when he got his first money, it was at that time $15, which is equivalent today to $455 at the age of 20. It was a poem about a butterfly, and he's like proud of himself. So he came to her and offered her marriage, and she said again that she can't because she needs to finish college. And then eventually she finished college, and he asked her again, and she said yes, and they got married. But life wasn't a fairy tale, and out of the 6 children that he had, one died of cholera, another died at a very young age, third he had to put in a mental asylum, a fourth died during childbirth from purpuric fever, which is caused by the lack of the hand washing of the gynecologist. Most of them used to go to the gross anatomy lab, where they would examine and do autopsies on corpses, and then without washing hands they would go to deliver babies. And if you recall, we discussed the person who was a Hungarian Jew in Austria who was asking people to wash their hands, and eventually they thought he was crazy, put him in a mental asylum where he died. Now they have a statue in his name in Austria as a savior of pregnant women. And only 2 children survived him. His wife died when he was 60 years old from complication of breast cancer. And And he was really not famous, but he continued writing until he was about 38. He went, and when he was in 1912, he went to England with his family, traveled, met over there people. One of the most important people he met was Thomas, a member of the poetry club there, who took him on different paths to show him botany. And each time he would lament the fact that he should have taken a different path because the different plants that he saw on that path were not as good as the ones he hoped to show him. And that led him to write the poem The Road Not Taken, which he sent to Thomas in 1915. And that poem, misunderstood not only by Thomas but by others as an advice to enlist in the war. He enlisted in the war. He was contemplating to enlist or not enlist. World War I started 1914. He enlisted and then he died, unfortunately, in that war. And eventually, his book, the Boy's Will, that published in London, became famous there, and a year later became famous in the US. So at 38, suddenly from nobody he became somebody very famous. And he continued to hold that level of fame throughout his entire life. John F. Kennedy loved him. And he actually read during his inauguration, but because there was light in his face, he could not read the poem he wrote for John F. Kennedy, so he recited from memory another poem. And when John F. Kennedy died, he had this poem that we discussed right now, In Miles to Go Before I Sleep, right, ending that way. Read on his funeral, was also read in the funeral of the Canadian President Trudeau, and adopted with small changes by Quentin Tarantino in his movies. Robert Lee Frost had his father died when he was 11, leaving them with only $8, the equivalent of about $250 nowadays. And they moved to Massachusetts from San Francisco, California, where his mom eventually died from cancer. And his sister, his only other sibling, he had to put in a mental asylum. His entire family was suffering from depression, as he had bouts of depression as well as his wife and kids. So he didn't have an easy life. Eventually died from complication of prostate cancer in 1988. When he was 88 years old in 1963, January 29, 1963. The epitaph on his tombstone reads, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world." So he still loved it despite quarreling with it and wondering why me. One of his last acquisitions, land acquisitions, was in Florida, where he would spend his winters, and he called it pencil something, because he said that everything he achieved was with his pencil, by writing. I think what he's able to teach us with his smile and positive attitude is that no matter how dark it might seem to us and hopeless, we can always find a ray of light. And when we shine that ray of light and share it with others, we become happier and richer through it. Wishing you all to never lose that spark and have that spark fanned into a fire that will warm not only you but others around you and shine a light and a path to those that follow. Stay healthy, safe. Be good, do good, and may good come your way.